Actually what I was going to talk about this afternoon was going to be, is actually kind of leads directly from the work that I was showing about a year ago, and that is really, the kind of overly formal title is Reconfiguring Our Historical Infrastructure into New Civic Regeneration. I would never be able to remember that myself. And, but really it's looking at, if I see, just go ahead one. Which way I push to go ahead? Just the one on the top? No. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Okay. And this was the title kind of slide from last year's talk, and I was talking about linear networks, and I'm talking again about linear networks, but we're focused more this year on railway corridors, and the ones that we talked about before for linear networks and how they made that middle space that we were interested in was like projects like St. George Street, the West Toronto Railpath, which is a more, goes along a railway corridor, which is really the direction I'm going more in today. And also the more sort of organic thing that was based on earlier kind of Garrison ravine work, where we kind of transposed that organic model into a new sort of civic regenerator machine for the Montreal International Gateways competition from several years ago. So I wanted to kind of focus on a number of projects. What we're doing right now is actually doing some in-house research on Pont Street in Toronto, which is a really kind of fascinating area for us, and it brings into play a lot of earlier work that we've done. So what I wanted to do today is talk about several kind of topics through some of the projects we've done in the last 4 or 5 years, which talks about agency and the autonomous agent, public space and infrastructure, and making objects and spaces, connections for parallel systems, and essentially leading to the whole idea about employment lands and building types that can be great generators from the railway corridors. The railway corridor is, for us, is one of those amazing systems, historic systems that run through the city, and is very often lined with either abandoned industrial or light industrial. It's also an area that has relatively strong boundaries of where you cannot trespass, and those are one of the kind of big things that we want to talk about, how you cross disciplines, how you cross agencies. And to talk first about the West Toronto Railpath, which was an area where there was a line that the city was able to obtain in the west end of the city that was able, so you have a whole rail corridor on one side that is still in operation, which is in fact the Union Pearson link, which is going to open soon. And then the West Toronto Railpath, which was kind of made into not just a cycling expressway, which was what it was kind of meant to be to begin with, but more of a linear network park that kind of reconnected the city back, made connections from the street up into the upper landscape. And the thing was that whole kind of landscape of that, the long view, it's almost like, Toronto's maybe Prospect Park, our one long view in the city that we can get. So that the whole idea of rediscovering that landscape, or discovering it for the first time, was really important part of that. So the system, which actually runs all the way from Caribou Avenue all the way down to Dundas and Lansdowne area here, is actually follows the entire kind of area of the railway, but also links into all of those streets. So where every street that used to have a dead end now has an opening, as these are shown, into streets that come into that area. This is at Wallace Street. So what you have, in fact, is a system of a linear network that actually started connecting all of these streets together into a linear system. And then where you had actually things like, well, then you have this, you see where they kind of connect into streets and into kind of buildings which are now starting to get developed around the edge. So it starts kind of spurring a whole kind of building intensification along these edges of the city. And then also, this is the Wallace Street Bridge, but where you have these pedestrian bridges, then you start having a really terrific system for people on the other side of the tracks to actually come over and can make use of that system too. So it kind of points the direction to where you want to have more linkages. This is another one of those street endings, very simply done, where the street ends there, different pavement, and then you continue through there. So the thing about the West Toronto Railpath, which we thought was important, is that you have a whole active transportation network that is really well used. You have the green boundaries of this kind of wild landscape of the railway corridors. You have the bridge connections. Here's the bridge going over, I believe this is at Pont, and community linkages back through the streets, and a train going right by there. And it all seems to work together pretty well. So based on that project and based on other work we've done, we worked with the Junction Triangle Rail Community, and I think I mentioned this project briefly last year as well. But this is a Metrolinx panel, and where the Union Pearson Link, which also runs by the West Toronto Railpath, which also, of course, goes from Weston down to Union Station. One of the kind of controversial things that was happening was this 5-meter sound barrier wall, which was being built up to, it's 5 meters high, which is quite high, and also kind of blocks off that whole corridor, and it was built to such an extent as if it were running at its capacity, the trains running at capacity. These are diesel trains, and so they were building about 10 kilometers of noise barrier walls. So we worked with, always anxious to burn bridges with large institutions, we decided to work with the community and actually put together some work with them. But the idea was that this is the base project which is happening. So you're having about 10 kilometers of noise walls being built. You have, here's the Weston Go, the Eglinton Crosstown. These are these connections that could be made to work. So you have St. Clair streetcar, the Bloor GO station, you have the West Toronto Railpath, Carlton Car, Bath. And there was a lot of mapping, but the point of the mapping was to show that there is, instead of kind of creating this kind of dense kind of wall 5 meters high, you could start kind of using that as a kind of a catalyst infrastructure for creating a shared boundary with the communities that could then start creating kind of pedestrian linkages and basically start connecting all of these neighborhoods that are all named here to the other side of the rail corridor, which were historically disconnected when the railway came through. And the idea is that it's a multi-user corridor, as it says there, and that the boundaries are shared rather than closed down. This is sort of a view of what's there. Sorry, wrong way. Here's that corridor in its, this is not its present conditions because they've taken down all of the beautiful forest, kind of wild forest that was there. And this is a 5-meter wall. Now, I'm exaggerating because apparently you can get these in pink and green and blue now. And they're going to put some public art murals on them as well. So we're being overly harsh, possibly. But the fact is that what that does is kind of blocks off a view across the corridor, which is actually kind of an important thing. We've lost the urban forest. And so the idea that we were proposing in a number of steps was that you could tone down this sound barrier wall to those areas where it was absolutely needed. Where it's not absolutely needed, you could build these green kind of walls. These are very similar to the Millennium Park in Chicago, the same model of building a steel framework and letting things grow up inside it. You can use the edges of it to create a kind of a parallel kind of public space network. And what the West Toronto Railpath illustrates is that within 9 or 10 meters, you can make a park. It can be, 3 kilometers long. It can be as long as the city is. But the fact is that these rail corridors give us this opportunity to create these kind of public space connections all the way through the city, from inner suburbs to downtown, and create, that divided city that we're all talking about actually has these kind of built-in networks that we could be using. More pedestrian bridges that connect the neighborhoods together, a new kind of urban forest kind of planted to replace the one that they took down. So if you go through a kind of number of quick scenarios of the West Toronto Railpath, and this is showing, for instance, that kind of forest that used to be there. This is it now without the forest that was there. And then that's the West Toronto Railpath with the 5-meter wall against it. And then, if you have to have the wall, then try kind of other things. Try pilot projects. Try to kind of ameliorate those things so that this whole kind of, obviously we're attached to the West Toronto Railpath, but there's all kinds of other kind of situations through there that those things can happen with. Here, for instance, at Dundas Street West, north of Bloor Street, someone's gone to some trouble to try to kind of landscape that narrow bit of piece of land there. So what's going to happen is that you're going to get a 5-meter wall, and this little strip kind of becomes nothing because it needs that space behind it. So at the same time, and this is a question about agencies and these very strong corporate kind of groups that kind of operate separate from the government and seem to be a bit above the government, so that when this is going to happen, why not, first of all, build the shared boundary? But then at the same time, maybe there's a time that the City of Toronto could start talking to someone about, well, maybe this is a good opportunity to make this a wider pedestrian network, and we could look at narrowing this street. The thing is like connecting things. It's like talking about silos that need to be broken down. At this level, you have the silos of the railways, which are unaccountable to anyone, as it would appear. Metrolinx, the province, the City of Toronto, and who else? I mean, there's lots of other, they all spring up. So the idea is that these opportunities are things that we should be taking advantage of. But the point is that if you are working for the city, or if you're working for Metrolinx, I mean, they have their boundaries very strictly kind of applied, so that you really can't be that agency that suggests those changes. So our kind of point of view is that as autonomous agents, it's sort of dropped into a situation where we can suggest things about the railway corridor, we can suggest things about the planning department, we can suggest things about transportation, all of those things, but they need to be cross-fertilized or cross-pollinated, as it were. And the agencies we have now are not able to do that. So that kind of is informing why we are actually looking at the DuPont Street study. This is actually an illustration from the hydro corridor Greenline competition from a couple of years ago, which again shows the idea of having a public space network at the same place where you have a train going by, green walls, rooms in the garden, essentially. So to take a step into the agency question, and I don't mean this as a criticism of the planning department, but I'm just saying that because of the limits that they necessarily have to place on themselves, that we're not getting the true potential of these areas in the city that we should be. Looking at the DuPont, this is the City of Toronto DuPont study, and really it looks at the employment lands in this area. I believe it's between Kendall and Ossington. And you can see the kind of, what's going on in this area is really quite an amazing part of the city. We have the hydro corridor, we have a whole established neighborhood to the north. We have the hydro Greenline corridor directly to the north. We have the rail corridor. And then we have DuPont Street, which is a long street without any several cross streets at key intersections, but basically one long area that is really used for employment, for earlier loft buildings, a lot of single-story buildings, and is really actually up for a lot of development applications right now, which are not particularly attractive. The disconcerting thing about the DuPont study for us was that there's an immediate adoption of the avenues model of building on DuPont Street without any real, I thought, contextual kind of analysis of what was there, and really looking at what was going on on the street, any kind of public space initiatives, and assuming that there's nothing in here where the city can really insert itself. If you look at, this is the Main Street model inserted into the DuPont study. It's a typical Main Street building, kind of 3-story base, set back, 3-story upper base, set back, 2 stories. And basically a very kind of thick building, and we were talking about some of those possibilities of employment type buildings this morning. And I thought it was interesting kind of the talk about the tertiary and secondary kind of systems that could actually make these kind of built forms actually more porous. And also, there's nothing going on behind here. There's no talk about the railway lands. The whole railway corridor is a system, we should be able to plan for 20, 25, 50 years into the future. I'll only be about 60 then. And we should be able to actually imagined electrification. We should be able to go past diesel trains. We should be able to talk about, as Andrea was talking about, maybe not this particular corridor, this conversation, but the idea that this could become adopted part of a city transit system. Why shouldn't we be developing guidelines that anticipate things that could happen in the future, and by anticipating them, start the direction, start the work in the right direction? This is a view of Pont Street of the city's study. And, you know, I just think, I think the city could do better than this. And this is a shot of the, these are the areas that are under review for application forms. So you can see there's quite a bit of things happening, potentially happening on the street. There's a lot of interest in development, and this is surely the time, or maybe 10 years was the time, 10 years ago was the time, to actually be looking at all those potentials that exist in this area. So going back into the hydro line corridor, this was the award ceremony. There's a lot of kind of attention given to this competition in the media, and it was run by workshop architects who did a really great job of attracting a lot of people to working on this. This is in the hydro corridor itself, of course. And this was the project that we worked on, and the idea of the project that was important for us to look at was the whole idea of a creative or incremental kind of development, because right now the hydro corridor, which runs across, beside the railway track, of course, is kind of filled with kind of parking lots, some little parkettes, and the idea was that you could kind of make this into, we thought it could be quite palatial in some ways, a series of kind of rooms that kind of went down the whole length of it, that became, see this is a part of that plan, but that became kind of a creative, so that where you had a parking lot, you developed the edge of it, and as it became more and more public, then that would become more into the model of the actual rooms in the garden that would kind of go along that whole stretch of the hydro line. The other part, the second part of that competition was looking at the underpasses, and this is an underpass at Dovercourt Road, where we talked about making, which are important parts to be able to kind of link an active transportation system along the Greenline corridor right across that overpass. Right now it's all for the rail line. So the idea was to actually cantilever out a passage that would go from the side of the train across the tracks, across Dovercourt Road. And that could be a spot for, right now you see this happening a lot with advertising. It could be public art. It could be a part where you kind of store bikes and people can walk right through there. And where it connects into the city, into the street, you could have public washroom. Heaven forbid, in Toronto you would have a public washroom, or a pop-up cafe, things like that actually start connecting that kind of landscape of public space back into the city in regular intervals. And then moving, so really at that point we were looking at the public space connections, the potentials of these linear networks and how those work to connect neighborhoods, and making new kind of long public spaces that connect back into the city itself. This is another project at Victoria Park Subway Station. It's a different kind of railway corridor, but one that we worked on in different stages over the last 10 years. And when we came to this project, this is the Victoria Park Station here. The subway tracks come along through here and then kind of disappear into the landscape and go underground. This would be your above-ground subway, Philip, that we were talking about at lunchtime. And this is at Crescent Town Park, where you have a lot of kind of, you have basically kind of empty kind of nondescript park here, and a pedestrian bridge connection. And then you have a lot of high-rise towers that have been built in the park kind of model. And so our kind of, our mandate in that project as urban designers was to kind of start figuring out ways that these open spaces, in the larger context, we had Massey Harris Creek, we had Crescent Town, we had the tracks, we have a park, and then we have a traditional sort of neighborhood in Bloor, the Danforth down there. So for us, the challenge was to actually start finding ways of making stronger pedestrian connections into that kind of transit hub at Victoria Park, and trying to bring more of a kind of a real linear kind of park nature, springing from these pedestrian routes from the Teasdale apartment buildings, across Victoria Park and into the Crescent Town buildings here, so that all of this becomes, which is already really well traversed, but trying to make it kind of a safer and a way that can kind of springboard into more public space. The system, these are some diagrams that kind of show the traditional block patterns, the suburban kind of towers, Victoria Park Avenue, which really just began to have sidewalks after this project was finished, the tracks, the ravine, the trace ravine, and the park system. So this is all kind of an area which is all of those systems are sort of disconnected, and how can you find a way of bringing all those together? The apartment linkages we were looking at were the Teesdale linkages from here, the Albion Avenue linkage, and also the Crescent Town linkage. So that was the existing condition of Victoria Park. I mean, this stairway seemed to be, speaking about agency, it was in a kind of a no man's zone where there's a sign that said there was like one flight of steps that was not going to be maintained by either the city or the TTC, so you took them at your own risk. It was a very bizarre situation, but it just somehow fell between those jurisdictional cracks. So when we were looking at that system, again, we wanted to make a sort of a transit plaza that started connecting that area with the actually at-grade entrance. At that point before, you actually couldn't get into the station at grade. This was just a kind of a concrete pit, and you had to go up those stairs to get into there, and that was the pedestrian bridge coming over from Crescent Town. And so one of the things that we did was to look at Victoria Park Avenue and start to kind of create a template for a transit plaza that would start kind of making Victoria Park into an actual kind of pedestrian rather than arterial route. So those were some of those diagrams. And starting from the inside of the station, trying to make connections between the transit and the open space. This is windows were actually put into this, which made a huge difference for the platforms of the subway station. And the transit plaza itself we did this with Richard Stevens Architects, actually with an at-grade entrance into the location and a bus terminal, so this becomes the entrance into the bus waiting area. This is at the green roof, so you can see how these connections are being made from the high-rise areas onto these pedestrian systems that go through here, and then you actually get a view of the green roofs on the station. This is the bus waiting platforms below. This is the bus waiting area as well. There's quite a grade change, but it's kind of terraced up, so that's actually a kind of pedestrian way there across the top, which is kind of transparent. You can look down. You have that connection back to the neighborhood. And again, that's another one of the pedestrian ways going back into the neighborhoods, and one of the stairways that connects from the Teesdale connection down. But that, unfortunately, has stopped at Victoria Park Avenue, because across the street you can't get up into this park from Victoria Park. So one of the things that we've been trying to promote is actually, and this is from the Crescent Town when you come out of that pedestrian bridge, that this whole area could then become a more developed park space. The space below becomes a kind of a terrace space where you can actually go up the hill back into the park. So, but because that's beyond TTC's kind of reach, and there's a bridge agency you have to talk to, and there's and then plus trying to get kind of public-private kind of conditions so you can actually move through these areas, means that this is kind of something that can happen, but it has a huge potential of this, again, a linear network that could actually work through the city and start kind of making things like connecting large objects like these large apartment towers that need that sort of more public edge. Another project that we worked on, which really looked at the building types as a beginning, was at the Yonge-Dundas precinct that we did for the City of Toronto Economic Development Group. And this looked at, actually, Yonge-Dundas is an industrial area which has become largely residential in the last 10 years since we've done this study. But this study is sort of firmly kind of implanted on somebody's shelf, by the way. But the idea, here we had a rail corridor here, and the idea was then to actually create a new road along the edge of the rail corridor with new building types that would actually be able to feed off that road. This is kind of very similar to what Rolf was mentioning about having secondary and tertiary kind of roads coming through here, and a building type that started to collect public space as a public-private space, because these areas don't really have any public space. They have very narrow roadways, right-of-ways, with just enough room for streets and a very narrow sidewalk. So the idea that you would develop a new kind of built form model that would allow for light industrial, that would create kind of public space and courtyards that would connect into, again, a linear kind of network that kind of ran along that railway corridor. These are, that's the kind of the diagram of the built form types we were talking about, where you have parts of it that become higher, parts of lower, and these are kind of the open space courtyards that start creating a zone of passage through those spaces too, and then this open space diagram where you get the existing green parks linking into that kind of linear kind of piece that then connects down into a park below. So this was actually important kind of slide that we used when we were talking about the Montreal project for the International Gateway. And these were three models of how cities could get, that Montreal was looking at when they were trying to determine how the city should progress. This is in the 60s. And this was the one that was adopted, more of the concentrated model. But what we're thinking now is because of these railway corridors crossing through our city and other cities, that this model becomes like an interesting way of making those connections between suburbs and the city by creating these public space networks based on, in this case, our railway corridors. We have City of Toronto. This is a kind of easy diagram to show that, but you have these rail corridors that kind of crisscross the city, which make really kind of interesting kind of prospects for making innovation centers that aren't the easy ones down at the waterfront, but are the ones that are in these areas where they actually kind of make a huge difference to depressed areas of the city. So this brings us to Pont, which is in this stretch right here. And so we were looking at the length of Pont going along here, looking at, these circles are really just kind of showing areas of interest that we're looking at. One is at the junction area where it's almost impossible to go through on your car without getting in an accident right now, because the net comes in, Pont, Dundas West, Weston Road, all of those things come together at that kind of juncture. And you can see through here, well, we have some aerial shots, it's easier to see, but the areas we're interested in looking at is that intersection, a typical stretch between Christie and Shaw along Pont, which brings into play the light industrial type we're looking at, the hydro corridor, Pont, and the railway corridor itself. And also, we're also looking at the Galleria kind of shopping mall, but I'm not showing that day because I haven't taken that far enough. But also, where the Perry crossing is, and actually further down at this zone here, we're looking at the College Dundas intersection as another area of the city that could, that actually kind of ties into the West Toronto Railpath, kind of traveling up through there. So this is one of the aerial photographs of that zone. This is kind of further to the west. You can see the whole kind of strange intersection that's happening to the west there. But this is where the Galleria is, where strangely enough, that shopping mall actually causes Pont to swing up to the north and swing back again. And then you can see where the road gets very, very narrow here. But the building stock here is kind of very simple. Some of it's 2 or 3 stories, some of it's single, and there's some very interesting larger building types here. This is the zone that we're interested in between Shaw and Christie, where you have actually you have a lot of kind of Franco-Lambert work up here, so a lot of housing on that zone. This is the hydro corridor, otherwise known as the Greenline, that travels through there. Here's our railway corridor. This is the former Ford Motor Company building. It's a very interesting kind of built form type that actually had a loading platform that loaded directly onto the railway when it was operating that way. Now, and then further to the east, you can see as it comes to the Davenport Road. So there's a whole length of kind of space there that's interesting to look at. Now, to look at the first, this first area between Christie and Shaw, this is the zone here. There's that zone. So what we have working for us is we have Pont Street. We have a very settled neighborhood here in the annex. We have a very settled neighborhood up here. we have the railway corridor, and we have an open space, potential open space network through there. So the things that are important for us are to, look at things like cross connections across there to connect this neighborhood over to that open space system and this neighborhood back into this system. And also, and so this is a diagram. This is very diagrammatic at this stage, but these are the kind of, this is a sectional perspective we're looking at, so that you could develop a lower level kind of retail or industrial area that kind of made a kind of a connection space right along that edge of the railway path, with connections either underground or with an access lane along the railway that created that sort of back lane access into the backs of these building types. These are floor plans, but these are kind of some of the earlier sketches that look at the railway corridor. Here's the railway corridor, and the idea of having a building type that actually connects right across the street to some public kind of amenity on the other side of the Greenline. This is a potential for an underground connection going over to the Greenline. So we've developed ideas of how at a lower level you can have a pedestrian or lane access, and then you have an upper kind of access which feeds into these kind of industrial types, and how, as you go up, these can actually get into higher kind of residential uses. So you allow the residential use to become that sort of leverage that can create that ability to actually build that light industrial space. We're very interested in the Toronto MADE group, part of that maker movement, about being able to kind of create those sort of like incubation spaces for entrepreneurial spaces, for trades, for people, for artists again, but for all those kind of spaces that you need, the 5 meter kind of floor to floors, the ability to get lots of light. So between those two streets, we're talking about like penetrating like a public space, a city property or something that becomes like a group kind of access point for these kind of industrial uses, so that you would have those spaces become kind of group servicing lanes and also become a public space that is jointly used by all of those buildings, rather than each building type now has its own driveway, its own servicing yard, and its own building. So this allows these buildings to kind of actually make more efficient use of the space, and also breaks up the length of the block. You get buildings, again, that can have light on all three sides there, and some light above on the rail side. These are kind of diagrams that show those kind of configurations which bring light into residential kind of units above. This again is that kind of diagram which shows those pieces that are working there, going to, showing the kind of the street and the lot and the space systems that we would bring to bear on that. Then the lower buildings, the industrial buildings, coming up with the residential pieces above. These residential pieces can be, low rise, or they can become higher. It's really just one of those things that whatever kind of the market bears or whatever happens, that allows those kind of lower spaces to kind of work as new industrial uses. These are a couple of views of that system. The second site is the junction site over here. So you have Dundas West coming up through there. You have DuPont coming up through here. And it goes through the underpass over to this whole kind of zone happening there. So this is an aerial view. It's just, I don't even want to describe it. It's just crazy. And you have these kind of spots, this kind of island, which is actually a bus stop, but it's because it's too small to be anything else. And so here's DuPont coming. It goes under that overpass. You can either kind of veer up here to go to Dundas West, or come up here to go to Dundas, or here to Annette. So basically, this is one of those things where we're kind of speculating how this is one of those really interesting junctures in the city where something really special could actually happen as an innovation center, as a new area for building in the city. So we really started to sketch out ideas about actual roundabout and creating a better situation for that actual part of the city, so that you would have Dundas coming through here into a kind of a roundabout which kind of connects it back into these other streets in a more kind of public kind of, I don't like the word celebration, but the whole idea that there's a public space, of something special happening in that zone where these things all come together along the railway. We really don't have the working plan of this, but this is showing kind of a modeling idea of how those things could all come together. So you have special triangular building that kind of marks that off, public space kind of fronting into a new frontage here for new buildings that become sort of a gateway into that west part of Dundas. Again, and then along the railway, the whole idea of creating where you don't have the space to have that, you actually do a raised pedestrian cycling piece that continues that kind of public space system along the edge of the railway. And the last site that I was looking at was the College Dundas site, where you have very strange condition where you have Dundas and College where they meet and they bridge over the railway. And there's also a spur line that comes across here. So this is the main railway line. This is the spur line. The West Toronto Railpath starts through there. And what happens in this zone, what we're proposing is that there's an area of the spur line that could actually be built over, similar to what they're doing. We saw several really interesting spots in Paris last summer where they're actually building over in this case it's a small spur line, this spur line, which allows that kind of more connective space, because there's so many fragments in this site that this would allow us to this would be the area that you would be building over. So it creates a kind of a new zone for building and to create another kind of juncture point in the site. These are some of the connection points here, which showing kind of the area that would be built over through here, creating kind of public spaces. These are, as I say, these are very diagrammatic, but what we're really, because we're just in the midst of doing this work and just exploring how you can get new built areas in the city where currently there are none. So you basically create buildings, create those zones for light industrial in the city, where currently, they're kind of really kind of deteriorated zones. So that's kind of showing the College Dundas area again. Again, the same idea of creating that kind of cycling link that goes through here, with another pedestrian bridge, by the way, that goes over to Sororn Park that's over there. Sorry. I wanted to finish with a little parable about another thing we did for the homegrown competition that was run by the David Suzuki Foundation. And what it was, we called it Local Monsters, because it seemed to us that this was a homegrown competition which was talking about a national park which happened to kind of follow the path of the Garrison Creek ravine. And it was all about kind of growing things that butterflies would be attracted to in front gardens, and things like that, very small scale interventions in the city. And for us, it seemed, well, we had been invited to participate, and for us, we thought, having gone through that whole system in the Garrison ravine, we're talking about connected ponds, creating stormwater kind of collection points in the city, reconnecting a public space system, that planting milkweeds just wasn't going to do it for us. And so we designed monsters, and we said these monsters are going to be, basically these open structures that you can climb up to, and you can see what the system is of a park. And we were also proposing these along the Metrolinx line, so you could actually go up and look over that 5-meter wall. And the idea of the monsters was that it actually reminded you that there was a larger infrastructural idea at play, and it didn't let the city off the hook by saying, yes, we're going to plant some wildflowers here, and we're going to put some little plaques that say Garrison Ravine on the sidewalk, and we've done our job. I think there's a lot more things that need to be happening in the city. This is our other kind of view of that. We actually have about 50 of these built in our office right now, and I could really use the space. But the idea is that these just become these markers. Obviously, it's a folly, but we actually had a lot of fun doing this. But the point is for us is that city building creative cities needs a spatial software, and borrowing a phrase from Keller Easterling. But you have to be able to look at the larger picture, and we need our larger agencies to work together to do that. The role of the autonomous agent, I think, is the role of the architect in many ways. So I encourage you all to kind of become autonomous agents and kind of push for these kind of cross-disciplinary things happening in the city. Thank you.